Okay, this video is a book review. Here's the book, Science and Christianity, Conflict or Coherence. Here's another type of cover for it. Here's the guy who wrote it, Henry Schaefer. He's a very world famous scientist. They said he's been nominated for a Nobel Prize 5 times. He's a graduate of Stanford, MIT. I think he did something at Caltech too. Then he was a professor at Berkeley. So anyways, he's sort of both a chemist and a physicist. All right. So now let's get into some of what the book's about. And I can also tell you it's the same thing. When you deal with all these liars and lightweight scumbags, they're always going to tell you, "Oh, we don't need Christianity. Science should be atheistic and objective." But what I'm telling you is that's wrong. You can't be objective if you're atheist because then you always sell out. As soon as money becomes involved, and money becomes involved in a lot of the bigger issues, they sell out. So atheists are lousy scientists. Typically, okay, and they're liars and they're kind of evil. Okay, to be an atheist after you've hit middle age is usually a sign that the person's evil. Okay, because the reason atheism gets pushed in neo-Darwinism is because they want ethnic cleansing, and you need to be able to get rid of morals in order to do that. So that's why they want to do it. So here's the guy. This is Henry F Schaefer. All right, so here's just some quotes from the book. What he did is, he just sort of studied all the history of science and Christianity. And what you find out once you actually do that is that everybody comes to the same conclusion that studies it, that's honest about it. Science comes from the Roman Catholic Church. That's a well-known fact. Okay, here's some quotes. One quote first from Sidney Brenner. He says, "Even God wouldn't get approved for a grant today because somebody on the committee would say, 'Oh, those are very interesting experiments creating the universe, but they've never been repeated.' And then someone would say, 'Yes, and he did it a long time ago. What has he done lately?' And then a third would say, 'To top it all off, he published it in an unrefereed journal called the Bible.'" Okay, so they want to control what gets published. I can tell you that's what's pissed me off too, is I'll publish the greatest theory in the world on the brain or on the spine, and the journal won't want to publish it because there's no money in it. Unless you're selling a drug or a surgical device, or you're staying in line with the standard theory, or you're answering a micro question, they don't want to hear it. They don't want any change. They don't want a big revolution in science. No, they want control of it. Okay, next quote by a guy named Dean Kenyon, a Stanford-trained biophysicist. He says, "And let us dispose of a common misconception. The complete transmutation of even one animal species into a different species has never been directly observed in either a laboratory or in the field. It is my conviction that if any professional biologist will take adequate time to examine carefully the assumptions upon which the macroevolution doctrine rests and the observational and laboratory evidence that bears on the problem of origins, he will conclude that there are substantial reasons for doubting the truth of evolutionary doctrine. Moreover, I believe that a scientifically sound creationist view of origins of life is not only possible, but it is to be preferred." And I would say the same thing. I was an A-plus student at Stanford University majoring in evolutionary biology. I've read about 50 books on the subject since then. It's good for microevolution, variation within a single species, like different types of dogs, different types of cats. Nobody's going to dispute it on that context. But it can't explain macroevolution. It can't explain the origin of life. It can't explain the Cambrian expansion. It's close to worthless for those things, okay? So it is not, origin of life is geologic chemistry. It's not biochemistry, okay? The Cambrian expansion, all the phyla just appeared out of nowhere with full body plans, okay? There was no transitional forms, and they appeared suddenly like a creation event, okay? The so-called occurrence of eukaryotes with the ingestion of a mitochondria. Why would it give up its ATP unless it was designed that way? It doesn't make sense. All right, well, I tell you all that because it's not a coincidence that the smartest people who ever lived tend to be very religious. The most creative people. Bach, Michelangelo, Newton, etc. And then you read the modern scientists who have actually studied origin life and are honest, people like James Tour. And then you say, well, what about guys like Nick Lane, who thinks it could happen without God? Nick Lane is being paid for by super rich atheists. Look up the funding for Nick Lane. Look up the funding for Richard Dawkins. Look up the funding for other people going down that path, and you will see they are routinely funded by powerful corporations that want atheism. And the reason they want atheism, the billionaire perverts, is Look what their goals are. They have to get rid of the white Christian men and bump them off, get rid of them, okay? Because the white Christian man, he's the force of freedom in the world, okay? He's the one that had the Declaration of Independence. He's the one that, promotes Christianity the most and says, look, everybody's equal in the eyes of God. Follow the Ten Commandments. Listen to what Jesus Christus said. That what you do to the least of my brother, and you do unto me. No. They don't want that. They want to be like Roman emperors, the equivalent of a god on earth, where there's nothing above them. So there is no religious god above them. They're the highest authority. That means they can do whatever they want. They can ethnic cleanse. They can get rid of all these poor people who they just view as stupid animals that are polluting the world. That's how they think. It's not my opinion. This has all been in writing for multiple decades. It's just the stupid proles don't read anything, so they don't know anything. And then they believe whatever nonsense gets pushed on social media, so they're completely gullible. The stupid proles will destroy themselves because they don't know anything. And it's sad, because everybody else gets destroyed along with them, because the majority will go down the path of being self-destructive morons. Okay, here's a quote from Philip Johnson. He was a lawyer guy who wrote a book about Darwin on trial. He said, a Chinese paleontologist lectures around the world showing that the recent fossils from his country are inconsistent with Darwinian theory of evolution. His reason is that the major animal groups appear abruptly in the rocks over a short time, like the Cambrian expansion, rather than evolving gradually from a common ancestor as Darwin's theory predicts. Darwin's theory predicts transitional forms in a gradual process, but that's not what the fossil record shows. Philip Johnson continues, when this conclusion upsets American scientists, he wryly comments, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. And that's true. Darwinism is a religion in the universities, and the reason it is a religion is because the billionaire atheists who want to be gods are funding it, and they will not allow any deviation from that. It's considered heresy to talk about intelligent design and creation, even though scientifically they make a lot more sense. A professor who talks about those things will be fired from the university. Okay. C.P. Snow, chemist, he says, when you look at the long, gloomy history of man, you will see more hideous crimes that have been committed in the name of obedience than in rebellion. Okay, so what I would say about that statement right there is that humans tend to be conformists because humans are really sort of a herd animal. We're a social animal. When you have a social animal, there's sort of two big categories of social animal. There are the pack animals, which usually means the hunters, like the wolves, for example. And then there's the social animal that's a herd animal, like, antelopes and cows, and humans too. We're cooperative. We're kind of weak. We're not much of a hunter-predator. Okay, next is Dr. Keith Ward. He says, science is not likely to get started if one thinks that the universe is just a chaos of arbitrary events, or if one thinks that there are many competing gods. If one believes in those things, then one will not expect to find general rational laws for the universe and nature, so one will probably not look for them. It is no accident that modern science began with the clear realization that the Christian God was a rational creator. Yes, he's a rational creator. It says in the Bible, everything was measured to its appropriate size and length. It says in the Bible, man is created in the image of God, therefore he's like God. Okay, he's part divine. He's also part beast, but he's part like God. And because we're created in his image, we can understand his rational universe. Okay? Johannes Kepler, I'm only thinking God's thoughts after him. Okay, so Robert Clark from his book, Christian Belief in Science, he says, however we may interpret the fact, scientific development has only occurred in Christian culture. The ancients had brains as good as ours. In all civilizations, Babylonia, Egypt, India, Persia, China, and so on, science developed to a certain point and then it stopped. Yeah, it was stillborn in the other places because they didn't have a worldview that would support its continued use. And a lot of times, like in China, they had scientists who invented some brilliant things, but then the Mandarin ruler said, no, you must not develop this, and it was all taken away from them or destroyed, okay? In India, a lot of smart people, but they basically had this concept of Maya, its universe is unknowable, so why bother doing anything, meditation, I think is stupid. Sit on your butt, stare at the wall, and say, Om, okay, what is that? Other countries, like Islam, they're like, to say that there's laws of things in the nature, that puts a limitation on Allah, therefore that's heresy, and that was partly why science didn't get started in some of those places. It was in something like around 1500, some real big, powerful sultan said that made the printing press forbidden. So how is science going to take off if you can't print results and people can't read them. Okay, continuing quotes here from this book. Isaac Newton. The most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. There are more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history. He spent more time reading the Bible, writing commentary on the Bible, than he did doing science. The smartest guy who ever lived. Okay, and this is pretty well known. You know, the John Lennox quote's really good. If you saw your name written in the sand on the beach, you would know an intelligent person who was literate had written it. Your name might only be 10, 20 letters. So how is it that the human genome, 3.3 billion base pairs written in complex chemistry, is going to spontaneously write itself? It can't. It's ridiculous. Okay. So this idea, it's far more complex than the most complex computer program written. We know the most complex computer program ever written could not be written by accident. So how could something far more complex be written by accident? It's ridiculous. The information has to come from somewhere. Okay. Oh, and he also points out, you know, how evil atheism is. Just 3 atheists, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, they caused more deaths in the 20th century alone than in all the previous wars recorded since the beginning of time. Okay? Atheism is used as a justification to bump off one's political opponent. Okay? Because there's no morals. You know, like Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, then there is no law, and everything is permitted, even cannibalism. Okay? All right. Schaefer continues, the significance and joy in science comes in those occasional moments of discovering something new and saying to myself, so that's how God did it. My goal is to understand a little corner of God's plan. The Big Bang, of course, reminds us of God's creation of the universe, ex nihilo, from out of nothing. The universe is expanding. It was created. And it was too hot when it was originally created, so the God had to come back later to create life. So it couldn't be a deist God. It had to be a theist God, meaning one that cares, rather than a deist God makes the world and walks away. It had to be a deist God motivated enough to come back, and it appears he came back in several separate times for the initial creation of life, for the creation of eukaryotes, for the Cambrian expansion, and at other times. Okay. So he continues, the Big Bang ripples and the subsequent findings are clearly pointing to an ex nihilo, out of nothing creation, consistent with the first few verses in the book of Genesis. The Earth's timetable is something like this. Big Bang about 14 million years ago. Life on Earth about 3.8 million years ago. 3.8 thousand. 3,800 million years ago. Okay, almost 4 billion years ago. 550 million years ago, the Cambrian expansion. 100,000 years ago, the appearance of humans is what's thought to be the case. The staggeringly high information content of even the simplest living thing is not readily explained by evolution. It's thought the simplest life form on Earth, I had read one time, had about 256 genes at the most minimal, and probably more than that. Second, the major feature of the fossil record is stasis, with long periods in which nothing occurs, and that's not consistent with evolution. Thirdly, Darwinian evolution. Thirdly, no satisfactory mechanism has appeared for the explanation of macroevolutionary changes. A mutation is just like scratching an audio CD of Bach, Beethoven, or Mozart, or Brahms. You're not going to improve upon it. You're not going to create improvements by scratching, damaging the DNA. Okay, you can get a micro change. You're not going to turn a fish into a dolphin. Okay, analogies between tiny changes in the beak of a Galapagos finch and the purported transition from dinosaur to bird seem inappropriate at present. Yeah, they're BS. And if you read the book by Jonathan Wells, Icons of Evolution, you will see so much stuff in evolution is all lied about. They put all kinds of fake, untrue stuff into the books. Piltdown Man, Haeckel's drawings, the pepper moths, all that stuff was dishonest lies made up to trick people into believing evolution. And it still gets into the textbooks, okay? Promoters of atheism, like I said, Richard Dawkins, given this title, I think at Oxford, Professor of Public Understanding Science. He's sponsored by rich atheists and atheist corporations. Same thing with Stephen Jay Gould, and same thing with Nick Lane. Okay, so these guys are paid to lie about atheism and atheistic evolution because they're getting big money. So they have to keep on lying. They're not allowed to objectively speak. And that's what I meant by atheism just leads to lying and it degrades science. I see that all the time in medicine and in nutrition. Okay, Henry Schaefer continues, microevolution is not controversial. The contemporary debate is focused on macroevolution. like the sudden appearance of the new file of body plans in the Cambrian expansion. Even if Francis Crick, who tried to figure out a way to make atheism seem realistic, admits an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to been satisfied to get it going. And he also is the same guy who said, maybe it's panspermia, maybe life from another planet landed on Earth, because he has no way to explain it whatsoever. But then you just pushed the case further back. Well, where did it come from over there? Okay, here's just a quote by Michael Behe. The interactive complexity of the bacterial flagellum. What he's talking about here is the concept of irreducible complexity, something that's so complex and so interactive with so many different parts that all had to come together at the same time. It couldn't have spontaneously evolved. This is irreducible complexity. And there's tons of things that are like that. The bacterial flagellum, the blood clotting system, the human brain, protein synthesis, okay? There's tons of things like that. The immune system. All right. The interactive complexity of the bacterial flagellum, the intracellular transport system, and many other cellular machines, like ATP synthase on the intermitochondrial membrane, are strikingly similar to that of designed objects we encounter in our daily lives. Therefore, the inference that those biological systems were in fact intentionally designed, that comes straight from physical data. Yeah, the plasma membrane of a human cell is an electrical battery. The intermitochondrial membrane is a nuclear power plant that splits the atom and then it produces electricity. These are incredible things, okay? The complexity is off the chart. It's way beyond what all the best chemists in the world could do if they were put together. So anyways, so that's basically the point of the book, that life on Earth is so amazingly complex, sophisticated, and magnificently designed. It had to come from a creator because it's orders and orders of magnitude beyond anything that could have spontaneously arisen. And the information had to come from somewhere and no one else can explain it. So anyways, hope you found that helpful. And the guy who wrote this book is as smart as it gets. This is a genius level scientist, like nominated for multiple Nobel Prizes, okay?